It's a pleasure to be here. I've never been to Middle Tennessee State University before, but I know about your school. And I know about it because I spent a bunch of time working at George Mason University, which was the home for a period of time of Nobel laureate James Buchanan, and had the great pleasure of working around Mr. Buchanan for a number of years. So it's wonderful to be at Mr. Buchanan's alma mater. He, of course, helped us understand political markets in a new way. I'm going to talk tonight a little bit about political markets and the way in which people engage with political decision making, but mostly I'm going to talk about other kinds of markets. I'll focus more on economic markets, pure sort of traditional economic markets. And I'm going to talk about those markets as they exist today in Africa. And I'm going to grab the switcher thing. But that's not where I'm going to start. I'm going to start instead by asking how many of you, if you can give me a show of hands, how many of you are going to graduate this spring? Oh, not so many. How many of you okay, this row, basically these two guys right here. How many of you are going to graduate next year? Okay, a couple more. So this group over here, I know you're PhD students, which means you're never going out into the job field. It's going to take a while. For those of you who are graduating, you're at that wonderful point in your life when you're excited and you're thinking about what your next steps are going to be, and people are giving you advice, aren't they? They're probably telling you things like, wow, if you want to really make a difference in a job, you should give it 110% effort, which is great advice. Or you should be a team player, which is also really good advice. Or if you've got a mom like me, I'm usually telling my son Thomas, would you at least put a tie on? And could you maybe run a comb through your hair? It wouldn't kill you to do that. So you're hearing a lot of advice about what you should do when you go out into the world. But I'm going to guess that you're not hearing the following, but tell me if I'm wrong. Has anybody been telling you go out and break things? Okay, well, guess what? You should be thinking about how you are going to go out and break things in the world. Because a lot of what our economy depends upon to grow, to be productive, to give people what they want, is people going out and breaking things in a positive way. And by breaking things, I don't mean you take a jackhammer and you break the sidewalk, or you take a sledgehammer and you break down a wall. I mean using your mind. You think about how to break products, make them better. You think about how to break processes, be more productive, produce more at lower cost, at higher quality over time. You think about how to break systems, or how to break ways of thinking, getting us to think differently about things we do every single day. This sort of incredible creative thought contributes to our society in almost immeasurable ways. And so I'm going to start a talk about Africa. It's going to seem a little strange, but I'm going to start a talk about Africa by talking about some folks who broke a lot of things. So bear with me for a couple of minutes. The folks who are on the screen, does anyone know who they are? Probably never seen them before in your life. So the gentleman on your left, a very interesting guy. His name was Jan Matzeliger. Kind of a funny name. He was a Dutch name. This guy over here is young Thomas Edison. So I'm going to talk for a moment about how they broke stuff. So Matzeliger came to the United States when he was 19. He was born in Suriname in Latin America. Had a Dutch dad, a Suriname mom. He left his country to look for opportunities. And when he got to the United States, it was the 1870s, and it wasn't the most welcoming place for someone who looked like Mr. Matzeliger. So he didn't have an easy time finding a job. He landed in Philadelphia. Philadelphia wasn't very welcoming. He ended up moving up to Massachusetts, where there was a lot of work in shoe factories. And the work that was going on in shoe factories was very intensive handwork. People were stitching shoes together. At that time, every shoe that was made was based on a form that was made to fit your foot, and your form would be different from your form, which would be different from your form. And the people putting the shoes together would be stitching up the tops of the shoes, and then they would by hand attach the sole to the top of the shoe. So in a good day, maybe you could produce, maybe if you were great, you would be the person adding the sole to the top of the shoe, and maybe you'd get through 60 or 70 shoes in the course of a day. Mr. Matzeliger looked at the process that was going on in his factory, and he said, I think I can do this better. I think I can do something different. And he actually figured out how to build a machine called a lasher that would automate the process of adding the sole to the top of the shoe. Created a different way of producing shoes. And he was so successful, the machine was so successful, that it radically changed the way shoes were produced. So that instead of someone producing 70 shoes a day the old-fashioned way, using his machine, firms could produce 700 shoes a day. Now, this created some disruption. The people who were tying the soles onto the shoes, they lost jobs. But instead what happened is people who were less skilled were able to come in, learn how to operate the machines, and what else happened? A whole lot more shoes were produced, large number of shoes being produced at pretty good quality because you weren't relying on the vagaries of stitchers, and the price of shoes started coming down. So pretty soon, poorer people were able to afford to buy good quality shoes. It's a pretty typical story about how innovation works. Edison, he's like he's crazy man. This guy, and I should say, Matzinger came to the United States, didn't have really any money. Poor guy. Thomas Edison's family, also pretty poor, pretty humble background. We all know Thomas Edison, right? He's the guy who invented the light bulb. Do you guys know he had over 1,000 patents? This was a man who was constantly breaking things, constantly thinking about ways to innovate. He's not only the guy who developed the light bulb, he's the guy who developed the phonograph, he's the guy who developed the motion picture camera, he's the guy who developed the alkaline battery. How can one mind do that many things? It's just almost unbelievable. He's also a guy who is very competitive. He was always competing against Nicholas Tesla. So he was driven not only by this incredible desire to learn and do things better and explore new ideas and new potential innovations, he was driven a lot by competition. The firm he started, which was Edison Illuminating Company, became General Electric. So here's a man who thought about new ways to produce light for people, new ways to bring sound to people, new ways to bring energy and electricity to people, and created a business that lasts to today. Here are two other people who are breakers of things. Really interesting folks. Do you know who these folks are? Anyone want to guess? Not you. You can't guess. Dr. DeBaker can't guess. Okay, so the woman on the left is Madam C.J. Walker. She was one of the first self-made millionaires among women in the United States. She was born in 1867 on a cotton plantation in Louisiana. Her parents were recently freed slaves. She was the first child in her family to be born free. She was the youngest of 5. Her parents died when she was 7 years old. She was an orphan, went to live with her sister and her brother-in-law. She was put to work as a domestic servant in the South. Family moved to St. Louis. She got work as a washerwoman making $1.50 a week. By the time she was 16, she was pregnant and had a child. She also realized that the people around her in St. Louis were starting to become a little more prosperous and had a little bit more disposable income. They were in a city, there were jobs available. So she thought, you know, something that folks in my community may want, something that the women in my community may want, are hair care products and cosmetics because, hey, they're girls and they probably want hair care products and cosmetics. So she actually built an entire business providing high-quality hair care and cosmetic services to women in African American communities. And she did this by developing a delivery system called Walker's Agents, which are kind of like Avon ladies. None of you are old enough in this room to remember Avon ladies, but there used to be ladies who would go from door to door and sell you lipstick and face cream. But Madam C.J. Walker did it 70 years before the Avon folks did it. And she was so successful at doing it that she was able to retire right around the time of the First World War as the richest self-made woman in the United States. And I use her picture because for a couple of years my husband and I lived in the town where she built her mansion, which is just north of New York City in Irvington-on-Hudson in New York. And she built a gorgeous home overlooking the Hudson River, but that's not all she did. She was a major philanthropist and was the major support for one of the largest YMCAs in the United States, the Indianapolis YMCA. So she's someone who came from a very poor background, saw opportunity in her community, met consumer needs, made a great deal of money by innovating around how to deliver services and the kinds of services to deliver, and then ended up becoming quite philanthropic at the end of her life. And then the final person, and then we'll switch to a different story, is young Andrew Carnegie. He has an amazing story. For those of you who don't know it, he came to the United States when he was 13 years old, family very poor. He is sort of a classic example of how markets change lives for people, which is where we'll get to in just a moment. Andrew Carnegie's father was a weaver in Scotland. And when the Industrial Revolution started, a new product was developed to mechanize the process of weaving. A steam loom was created. Andrew Carnegie's father lost his job, and his family didn't have another opportunity, was scrambling to make money, facing real financial difficulties. So his mom borrowed 20 pounds, a huge amount of money back then. And the whole family moved to Pittsburgh, where she had sisters. When he got to Pittsburgh, Andrew Carnegie went to work at age 13. Right? Child labor laws were different then. Doing a job called bobbin boy. He would move bobbins at textile factories, and he got paid $1.20 a week for that job. He worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. A lot of work. But he was very ambitious. And he went from being bobbin boy to being a telegraph operator to becoming private secretary for a Pittsburgh industrialist. And just after the Second World War, he's doing very well. Just after the Second World War, he realized that iron was going to be very important for the US economy. And so he started building iron bridges in the United States to replace wooden bridges that might have been damaged or hadn't been taken care of during the war years. And he made a fortune. He made so much money that he said, wow, I need to stop working pretty soon, because if I keep working like this, I'm going to become a different person, and I don't necessarily like the person I'm going to become. At this point, he was making about $50,000 a year, which would have been an enormous salary back then, but he actually didn't stop working. What he did was figure out how to use the Bessemer steel process in Pittsburgh to create a steel company that by the year 1900 produced more steel than the amount that was produced in all of Great Britain that year. He created such an efficient process that he could transform the way the United States looked, from being a society where we had a lot of buildings made out of wood, a lot of buildings made out of stone, to being a country of skyscrapers, to being a country with railroads across the country. He did eventually sell his business, and when he sold his business, the day of the deal, he sold to J.P. Morgan. You guys may know this story. J.P. Morgan asked him to write the number down of how much he wanted for his firm. Carnegie maybe didn't really want to sell it. He wrote down a number that he thought would never be accepted, but J.P. Morgan accepted it. He wrote down $460 million, and J.P. Morgan agreed to buy Carnegie steal for $460 million, making him the richest man in the world. And then he proceeded to give away $350 million of those dollars. He devoted the rest of his life to philanthropy and did something really interesting. He funded the creation of over 2,500 public libraries around the country. Because when he was that young 13-year-old boy who came to the United States, he wasn't able to go to school. And he was touched, he had always been touched by the experience of one of the local folks in Pittsburgh opening up his private library to young boys to allow them access to the information that he had in his library. So one of Carnegie's ways of giving back was to start libraries. Okay, so what the heck does all this have to do with today? What does it have to do with Africa? I want to very briefly show you some other folks who destroy things. And you may know these faces more than you knew the faces of Madam C.J. Walker or Jan, whose last name I keep forgetting, Mats Zeliger. So here you have some creative destroyers. Let's use that phrase. All the way on the left, you have colleagues here from Middle Tennessee State. You have a graduate, I guess he probably was a graduate in 2014 who won the Business Innovation Award here. Wes Compton, he won $2,500 for thinking up a business application to develop software that would prevent cyberbullying. Very cool, very cool. Wes is thinking of ways to protect people, giving people a new tool to try to protect themselves. So you probably know Brian Chesky, who is a great disruptor, innovator. Do you guys know who he is up on the top? Brian Chesky is the guy who started Airbnb. He's like, I don't know, he's ridiculously young. He's like 27 or something, and a billionaire. Because he thought of this great new idea. He broke a system. Why do we have to go to a hotel? Why do we even have to go to a B&B? Why can't we figure out if we have a spare room and we want to be hospitable, we can invite someone into our home and make a little bit of money by inviting them into our home. And he makes a little bit of money by facilitating that transaction. He's like the eBay of hotels, right, or homes. Very interesting. Arianna Huffington kind of broke the way we think about producing news. You cannot get away from HuffPo now, can you? There's a HuffPo for everything. There's a HuffPo for women. There's a HuffPo for Alaska. There's a HuffPo, I don't know if there's a HuffPo for Ghana, but there might be. I mean, she really allowed us to connect with each other in very different ways. And then Angie Hicks, a woman who was an administrative assistant and worked in restaurants when she was younger, also helped us connect to people and information in new ways by creating Angie's List. So these are some of the people today who are breaking things, breaking products, breaking systems, breaking ways of connecting us to other folks. And that is really important, to have societies where people are willing to break things. They may be driven for different reasons. As I said a few minutes ago, Edison was driven by competition. He competed. He wanted to beat Tesla in the race to provide expansive electricity services in the United States. But some people are driven by the puzzle of it all. Carnegie was driven by the puzzle of, how do I put together the best steel company in the United States? Jan was driven by the puzzle, how do I make shoes better? How do I make shoes in a way that will reduce costs so that lots of people can have access to shoes? But then some people are driven by profits, no question about it. Some entrepreneurs want to make money, and they're rewarded in a market society for making good and valuable innovations because people are willing to pay them for it. But what's important, I think, and where I want to get us to, is that creative destruction is something that we as a society in the US, we embrace it. It's not always comfortable. Creative destruction, this idea that in an economy, industries are changing all the time, businesses are changing all the time. The kinds of jobs that are available today are not going to be the kinds of jobs that are available 20 years from now. The kinds of jobs that my parents had are not the kinds of jobs that my grandchildren will have. That process of industries evolving, businesses changing, the economy shifting, reflects differing consumer demands, but it's a messy process. For some people, It can be a painful process, no doubt, but it's a process that's essential for us to experience economic growth. And I want to talk for just a moment about what it is that we need to have a society that supports creative destruction, because we do need some things. We have to have some of this support structure for people to pursue a path of creative destruction, not destructive destruction, but creative destruction, positive, beneficial destruction. We need competitive markets. You have to be able to go in and compete against people like Andrew Carnegie if you want to help further the evolution of the steel business, and it has evolved over the course of the last century. You have to be able to get in and get out. It's as important to try things and fail for a lot of people as it is to get in and be successful the first time. Failure is costly, and if you live in a society where you can't fail, people tend not to try as much. We need to have price signals that tell us, wow, you know, here I am, I'm in school, you guys are going to graduate. Should I be going into engineering? Should I be going into computer science? Should I be going into history? Should I be spending my time trying to solve a puzzle around creating software that's going to signal when cyberbullying is going on or not? Markets provide us with price signals that tell us what other people value, and those signals help direct us towards societally beneficial activities. We need secure property rights. If you are going to develop something, if you're going to innovate and someone can come along and take your innovation away from you, are you going to have incentives to innovate, spend the time, the resources necessary to create new products, new processes? You're not. We need a rule of law that says, hey, you know what? In this society, we're not going to arbitrarily restrict your ability to compete. We're not going to arbitrarily restrict your ability to exit a business. We're not going to arbitrarily take your stuff away from you. We're not going to arbitrarily say, hey, today only people named Carol can compete in this area, but people named Joe, we're really sorry, they're not allowed in this sector of the economy at all. And then finally, we need some stable, sound economic policies that reward innovation. So policies maybe around taxation that is not excessively burdensome might be one good example. When we have all that support system, and when we have some freedom, what we see is people doing the kinds of work that I just talked about, that Andrew Carnegie and Madam C.J. Walker were talking about. And boy, is that important. It's critically important to have innovators in our society because they drive economic growth. Doing the same thing over and over and over again the same way does not drive economic growth. Innovation makes us more productive. It helps us to reduce the costs of products. It helps us to do more with less and conserve resources. And that means if you add all those things up, that pretty much everyone benefits. We get more stuff. You may not necessarily like that we have a lot of stuff, but we definitely get more stuff. Over time, that stuff becomes less expensive. Over time, and you know, the quality may or may not go up, but over time, it usually does go up. Think about something that is as ubiquitous as a calculator. When I was young, calculators were not on phones because there were no such thing as cell phones. Calculators were not in cereal boxes because they cost like $100. So there were no calculators in cereal boxes. You had to spend a bunch of money to go out and get a calculator if you were going to take calculus and you needed the calculator, or you were going to take some other math course and you needed the calculator. Today, calculators are basically, they're almost like free goods, aren't they? They're like pencils. You never buy a pencil. You probably, do you guys even buy pens? You don't buy these things. They're just around. They're just there, and you can always get them. A calculator, an incredibly powerful tool, is something that we don't even think of, but here it is. It's in here, along with this remarkable thing that's called a map that I can use to get from place to place. So innovation over time, it may start as an expensive thing that only benefits very wealthy people in a first iteration, but over time what tends to happen with innovation is that it becomes more accessible to greater and greater segments of society. So that's my long introduction to the talk. And you're wondering, I thought I was going to a talk on Africa. What does this have to do with Africa? It has a lot to do with Africa. It has a lot to do with Africa because For a long time, people in Africa have been breaking things, but they've been breaking the wrong things. They've been breaking political processes. They've not had the opportunity to break products or productive approaches or systems of production. And so that's been a problem. Very, very quickly, very quick, right? We could spend a whole semester on this, but we will not. We'll spend a few minutes on this. You know, if you're a typical American and you think about Africa, you probably think, wow, that's a really tough place. It's a tough place to live. You know, a lot of people are poor, a lot of people are hungry, there's a lot of violence, a lot of conflict, and there is still a lot of poverty, and there is still malnutrition and hunger and food insecurity, and there are still places where governance is not great, and in part that's a result of a very difficult history. For those of you who are econ students, there's some wonderful work that's been done by a guy named Nunn on the long-lasting impacts of the slave trade on African countries. And Nunn has done some very, I think, very rigorous work that shows that the countries that suffered the most from the slave trade had the largest number of their population taken, whether it was to go to the Atlantic slave trade or to the other slave trades up through northern Africa, for example. Those are the countries today that are still suffering from problems of exceptionally weak governance and from very poor economic growth. DRC would be an example of a country like that, where the Kingdom of Congo actively supported the Atlantic slave trade. So really difficult history, and you know, a history where governance has not been great, colonial governance not great, post-colonial governance has often been ruled by big men. Ruled by a limited number of elites, not an inclusive rule that has benefited the majority of people, but a rule that's benefited a minority of the population, and enriched that minority of the population. Levels of conflict have been pretty high. One of the higher levels of regions in the world, and there have been shockingly high barriers to trade in African countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So tariff barriers, which are just taxes to get goods across borders. Tariff barriers that are 35%, 45%, 100%, 1,000% for some items. Not the sort of tariff barriers that we'd see in the developed world, which might be 2%, 3% on average, but exceptionally high costs of moving goods across borders. And there's been a lot of political instability. So people competing and breaking political processes more than competing in the marketplace to create new and better products for other people. But in part, people aren't able to compete in the economic marketplace because the political marketplace has been so constraining for entrepreneurs in Africa. It's not that there aren't entrepreneurs everywhere, there are entrepreneurs in Africa. But they tend to exist in a highly informal setting rather than in the formal setting you'd see in the United States. Okay, so this history, difficult history, problems with governance, poor economic policies that did things like set high tariff barriers have led to, you know, limited growth traditionally, low income, and not a lot of human flourishing. But my story to tell you tonight is that's increasingly less and less true across Africa. It's more and more the case that things are changing in a positive direction and that growth is happening. So if we walk through some of these numbers, we don't have to walk through every one because that would be boring if I just read you the slide. So we're not going to do that. But we're going to pick a couple of things to talk about. And maybe the first one is actually a good one to talk about, because what happens when inflation rates come down? For you as a consumer, if inflation rates come down in your country, it means you've got more money in your pockets. Inflation's like another kind of a tax for you. And it also creates a lot of instability for people. If you're not sure that tomorrow you're not sure your dollar is going to be worth $1, maybe tomorrow your dollar is only going to be worth 80 cents. You're constantly worrying about, what do I need to go out and get today? Because tomorrow it's going to cost me a whole lot more money to get that thing. And so you spend a lot of time thinking and strategizing about what to get when, rather than concentrating on being productive. So the fact that average inflation rates in Africa have come down over the past couple of decades from about 22% to less than 10% is a nice benefit for people. It means a little more money in folks in their pockets. Another thing to mention is that there has been increasing regional integration across African countries. So East Africa has been a very dynamic regional trade area. East Africa has been increasingly working with Southern Africa. It's kind of like, imagine in the US, New England decided we're going to start trading with the New Yorkers and with the Southerners. In the US, we have a gigantic free trade zone, so we don't really worry about things like this. But if you can imagine walls around New England, walls around the American South, walls around the American Southwest, tariff walls, political walls that made it hard to move people, made it hard to move products across those borders, we would be a little bit less wealthy. And in Africa, they've had very difficult, very challenging relations with their neighbors. And so it hasn't been easy for people to cross borders. It hasn't been easy for goods to cross borders. And so that's hindered economic growth as well. But the changes that have been taking place over the last couple of decades now, actually, have been changes at a higher sort of macro level that are leading to real differences at a micro level for people in their lives. And one of the most important changes, I think, is that there actually is a growing middle class in Africa. Africa has the world's fastest, most quickly growing, most rapidly expanding middle class in the world today. Now, so take a breath. I'll take a breath. In part, that's because it started from a very low base, right? So there weren't a lot of middle class folks 20 years ago. But today, 13% of Africa's population is considered to be middle class. And middle class folks have some money to spend, and because they have some disposable income, they're fueling a revolution in the service sector. So let's talk about what else is changing. The continent is growing. You can see that the real low point for Africa, this is statistics coming from The Economist, the real low point for Africa was really in the early part of the 1980s, and since then there's been a pretty dramatic rise in growth, pretty steady. It did take a dip when everything else did, and you can't really tell this in 2008, 2009, but has bounced back really quite dramatically. And you can see some of the world's most rapidly, quickest growing economies for the last 20 years have been African economies. So countries like, let's see, so Ghana's in here for this decade. So countries like Nigeria, Ethiopia. Ethiopia, you see, stays for the last 20 years, has 8% growth rates. Really quite remarkable. And Ethiopia doesn't have mineral wealth. This is not mineral-driven growth in Ethiopia. Mozambique, Tanzania, there is a lot of these countries have had natural resource discovery. So part of the reason they're growing is because they've discovered oil or they've discovered natural gas. But for a number of these countries, that's not the case. Or Zambia has discovered cotton. So what you can see is African countries have been growing, and we don't necessarily hear the story of that growth. Oh, sorry, whoops. I wanted to show you how African countries compare to some other parts of the world. And so compared to high-income countries, which are the red line, you can see that African economies have been growing a little bit more robustly, starting where, like around the 1996 point. Compared to other developing countries, but taking out China, because China is its own special case, which is the black line, they've also been growing quite rapidly. Okay, so it's kind of a new landscape in many African countries. I've been going to Africa for over a decade now, and I can see the change. When I go to a place like Kenya, when I go into Nairobi today is very different from, to me anyway, seems very different from the Nairobi I first visited in the early part of the 2000s. I'll tell you one way in which it's definitely very different. When I go into Nairobi, there are cars everywhere. People can afford cars. And they're not necessarily junky cars. They're kind of nice cars. And it's a pain now because there's a lot of traffic and there's some more smog and pollution. But that's an amazing thing, that people have enough disposable income that there are gigantic traffic jams in Nairobi. So institutions are changing, and that means incentives that people have to engage in the economy are changing. And And you can see some of the results. So GDP, you saw just a moment ago, had that growth, the growth chart from The Economist, which was trending up, 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 up. GDP growing at just under 5% a year for a long time now in Africa, which is twice as fast as GDP was growing in the past, not too distant past, and importantly, economies are diversifying. So a lot of times we think about Africa as a place that only produces mineral wealth or only produces primary agricultural commodities. That idea of Africa is really rapidly dissolving. It's not that countries aren't producing primary ag anymore, but they're really focused now on value-added agriculture. Ghana is a nice example of that, and they're diversifying away, especially into the service sector. There's not a ton of manufacturing in most African countries. South Africa would be maybe an outlier on this, but Africa seems to have gone from maybe producing a lot of primary commodities to leapfrogging over manufacturing to producing a lot of services now. Doing business, this is important, is less costly. A number of the countries that you saw on the list of most rapidly growing countries have focused very carefully on the doing business indicators that the World Bank produces and tried to look for ways in which they can reduce regulatory burdens on people who want to do business. And that would mean reduce the number of steps it takes to start a business, reduce the cost that's involved in starting a business, create opportunities for people to go bankrupt and then take resources that were tied up in a failed business and put them back into an economy. Make it easier to register property. Those are very important changes that have been taking place. So what you'd see as a result of those changes taking place is a lot of dynamism in a number of different sectors of African economies. So you would see that the banking sector is changing quite dramatically, meeting the needs of an enormous unbanked population across Africa. And one of the ways that the banking sector has changed is that governments have allowed other people to come in and compete. They've allowed a little bit more entry. That competition is really good for consumers who now have more choice about where to bank and more offerings around banking services. There's a lot of construction everywhere you go. There are skyscrapers being built, roads being built. That's really interesting, great to see. Infrastructure's being developed. Probably the change you've heard about if you're familiar with Africa is the telecom change. Telecom services have been liberalized in most countries, many countries. And so this has led to an enormous boom in the use of mobile tech and all different kinds of mobile tech products. And I mean, even I talked about the cars just a moment ago, even travel, domestic travel in Africa is a growing sector of African economies. People have enough resources that they're either getting in cars or buses or airplanes and traveling places. So the landscape, the economic landscape is changing very rapidly. Some other trends to talk about: Africa is also urbanizing very rapidly. People are moving into cities. This creates a very broad division of labor in cities. There's not a whole lot necessarily to do in the rural countryside, but people go into cities and they conglomerate together and they find interesting new ways to do business. More and more, Africa is integrated into world markets. They're exporting more stuff outside of their borders and not just this primary stuff. And interestingly, more and more people are investing in Africa. So if you look at that FDI number, the foreign direct investment has changed from being about $9 billion in 1990 to being, this is FDI, about $67 billion last year. That's a pretty big rise. And we'll talk, those are not the only financial flows going into Africa, but those are important financial flows. This means that the economy, if you look at the continent as a whole, the continent's economy has tripled since the year 2000. So here's a look at the urbanization trends. Africa is the most rapidly urbanizing location or region of the world, people moving into cities more and more. I think that probably bodes well for economic growth. I want to show you a little bit about, these are the financial flows into Africa starting down at 1990. You can see not a whole lot of money going into Africa. The yellow stuff is foreign direct investment. It's businesses investing in Africa, basically, to use a shorthand. The blue stuff is foreign aid. And the gray stuff notice how important that gray stuff is. That gray stuff is remittances. It's people sending money back home to their families. It is the most direct form of aid that exists in the world. It's me sending money back to my mom so that she can improve her home, or she can send the younger kids to school, or she can buy a car. She can do whatever it is that mom wants to do with the money that I'm sending back to her. So remittances have grown substantially at the same time that foreign direct investment has grown. You can see aid flows have actually grown as well. And this is a map that shows you, or this graphic is a little bit fuzzy, I apologize for that, but it shows you who's investing in Africa. Sometimes people get kind of, Americans, I don't know if any, I can't speak to other people, but Americans get kind of freaked out if they are thinking about Africa. Oh my God, the Chinese are investing in Africa and we are getting left behind because the Chinese are in Africa. Well, yes. The Chinese are investing in Africa. They're investing a lot in Africa, and there are a lot of Chinese people in Africa. But this report shows us that actually the US is the #1 investor in Africa. American businesses doing the most to invest in the continent, followed not by China. China's #7. China's not even #2. The UK is #2. So all of this adds up, all of this change, which is only possible if governance has gotten a little better, if economic policies have gotten a little better, if people's property rights are a little bit more secure, not great, but marginal improvements, all this adds up to millions of people escaping abject poverty. Millions fewer people in Africa are living in abject poverty today than they were 20 years ago. It means that people are living longer lives. That's a good thing. It means that there is greater demand for consumer products, and it means that there's the people who have a little more space, a little more freedom to act because institutions have lightened up a bit. Those people are finding ways to be creatively destructive instead of negatively destructive. So now, I just want to talk to you, because I'm closing up on my time, I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about some very interesting examples of African creative destruction. And I'm going to start with Bridge International. Bridge International is breaking, or trying to break, the education system. Creatively destroying it would be a better way to say it. Creatively destroying the education system. So Bridge International is a for-profit company that helps create basically franchises. Primary school franchises and secondary school primary school franchises primarily. Based in Kenya. Kenya is a hotbed of entrepreneurship these days. Lots of interesting things going on in Kenya. So the Bridge folks basically sell to, what's your name? Stephanie. So the Bridge folks, Stephanie would come along and say, hey, you know what, I want to start a school. I want to start a Bridge Academy. And the Bridge people would give you the formula for starting a Bridge Academy. They would do things like help you find a piece of land, tell you how to build your building, and it's got to be painted green. They would give you a curriculum that they've developed. They would explain to you how do you find parents to come to your school. Primary school education is free in Kenya. Government provides primary education. But Bridge Academy has been able to, over the past couple of years, open up more than 100 academies because there is a strong demand for high-quality private education in Kenya, despite the fact that the primary education is free. So as you can see, they've done things like provide e-learning tablets to kids. They're innovating around how do we teach young kids? How do we bring technology to young kids to give them a better educational experience? And they're monitoring test scores for kids so they can go back to parents and say, your money's been well spent. Your kids have learned more in our schools than they would have learned in other schools. Your investment is a good investment. We will use your money that you've paid in tuition to expand our offerings, and pretty soon there probably will be 1,000 Bridge Academies, not only in Kenya, but depending upon the regulatory environment in other countries, maybe in Tanzania, probably not in Ethiopia, but maybe in some of the other East African countries that are neighbors to Kenya. So really interesting model. Public education not working so well. Let's figure out, parents want their kids to be educated better. Let's figure out a way to bring better education to kids. And the Bridge International folks came up with one model to do that. It's not the only model, but it's a model that seems to be succeeding, and interesting because it's a for-profit model. They've gone through rounds of financing with venture capitalists and have been very successful so far. So that's kind of cool, breaking the education system. That's a hard thing to do. Here's my favorite example, though. I love this example. David Curia, the entrepreneur behind Ecotech, grew up in one of the informal settlements in Nairobi, realized, because he would, that it was actually quite difficult for his mom and his sister to have to leave the house to go out to use the restroom or water or facilities in the evening. It wasn't necessarily safe. They couldn't necessarily get what they needed. So he thought, wow, you know, what if I could provide sanitation services? What if I could provide sanitation services to people who live in informal settlements in Nairobi? What if I could bring clean water to them? What if I could bring showers to them? What if I could bring functioning, working toilets to people in the informal settlements so that they didn't have to use the overused, run-down facilities that the city is providing or not providing, because the city can't or wouldn't necessarily get water working in these areas. So he came up with this idea of Ecotech. He creates these buildings. There's a whole building here where you can go in and you can bring your jerry can and you can fill your can up with clean water for a fee, and you can take a shower for a fee. You can use a toilet for a fee. And that's something you can't do in your homes in the slums because there is not running water going to your shack. So you can't take a shower in your home. So for a small number of Kenyan shillings, you can go into one of these Ecotech facilities, and the thing with the bars in front, he usually also has little shops associated with them, so you could pick up, if you need to pick up soap, or if you need to pick up bread, or if you need to pick up whatever you pick up in little shops, he will have it there too, and maybe he'll have a barber there. So you can go in and get a couple of different services and sanitation stuff. Water, shower, toilets. And people are willing to pay for it. So Ecotech is a solution to the problem of inefficient government provision of sanitation services. And there are over 16 Ecotechs now across Nairobi serving that need. So he's breaking something, and he's doing it in an interesting way. And then if you know any example of innovation from Africa today, you probably know M-Pesa. M-Pesa is mobile money. Pesa is money in Swahili. So M-Pesa is this amazing example of breaking a banking system. Back in 2006, there was no M-Pesa. M-Pesa is one of the relatively small number of examples of development projects that work well. So this was a project that was initially seed funded by the British Development Agency, DFID. They gave the folks who had the idea for M-Pesa, I think they gave them $1 million, and they said, go create a mobile application that will allow people to SMS money to each other. This is a grand idea because it is not easy to move money around if you're not banked. It either means you have to carry money in your pockets, which can be dangerous, or it means it's going to take you a long time. You've got to get in a bus. You've got to take the money to your mom. She's in the country. Then you've got to get back. There's a high opportunity cost for moving the money around because she's not going to go to the bank branch because there is no bank branch. And even if there was a bank branch, she's not going to go into the bank branch. So the M-Pesa people came up with a way to move money around using mobile phones. And because mobile technologies were becoming less expensive, more people had mobile tech, people very quickly decided, wow, this is a pretty great thing. I go into an M-Pesa store, I buy a little card, it gives me a number, I add the number onto my cell phone, that's equal to a certain amount of money. I can text people money using this code, basically. So I can pay, I can send you money. Let's say you've just had an emergency and you need to go to the dentist. So my daughter is out in the countryside. She needs to go to the dentist. Instead of me having to get in a bus and bring her the money, or her having to get into a bus and come to me, I just text you the money. This is wonderful. I can pay my bills using M-Pesa. I can pay my utility bills. I can pay all kinds of bills, which means what else can I do? I can develop a credit history using M-Pesa. And people are starting to track M-Pesa use as a way to develop credit histories in places where there aren't really credit agencies or not this kind of credit agency. But the interesting thing about M-Pesa is that well, whereas there were 0 users in 2006, there are over 20 million users today of the M-Pesa services. It's created hundreds of jobs, this system, by creating these kiosks where people will go and buy their M-Pesa top-ups. So it's been a job creator, and it's been especially useful for the very poorest of the poor. So originally there was some thought that, well, people living on $1.25 a day, for example, wouldn't be able to use M-Pesa. They might not have phones. M-Pesa is a little bit like Western Union. They charge a little bit of money to do the SMS messaging. So that's the business model. You get a couple of shillings for every time you send an SMS. Well, so it turns out that the M-Pesa use by people who are at the bottom end of the income spectrum, making less than $1.25 a day, making $1.25 to $2 a day, has really been quite strong. They've been using M-Pesa quite a lot. And for them, it's been helpful because it's a great way to smooth out erratic incomes. So when they do have emergencies, rather than having to go kill livestock to get money, or rather than having to go back to the family and travel to get the money, they're able to get the money much more rapidly. And so it's keeping people apparently from having some of the very difficult challenges and choices that they make when they're in an emergency situation. So, and M-Pesa has been copied. You can go to most developing world countries now and you'll find an M-Pesa-like service. So not only has it served 20 million people in Kenya, you'll find M-Pesa-like offerings in well, every country I go to. There's something like it, except for Ethiopia, which is still not really a very liberal financial market. So great help to poor people. But you know, I'm painting a happy story. I don't want to give you the impression that all is rosy and well in Africa, because everything is not rosy and well anywhere that I know of, except maybe with the exception of, I don't know, Norway or the Scandinavians are always fine. But aside from the Scandinavians, there are difficulties, and one of the more disturbing problems that I see is that conflict levels actually are rising again in sub-Saharan Africa. For a number of years, the conflict levels had been decreasing, but they have been rising, and conflict makes it costly to do business. It's very disruptive, and so we might expect to see lower levels of economic growth over the coming couple of years if this trend continues. You may have noticed the news last week that there was a coup in the West African country of Burkina Faso. So that's a little bit of a concern. And there certainly is more that needs to be done to improve things on the ground in most African countries. Most African countries still have relatively low levels of good governance, which means the rule of law is pretty weak. There's not necessarily a lot of voice and participation that the citizens have in their political system. Political opponents may still end up in jail, sometimes worse. Corruption levels are still high. You know, there's corruption in many places. Again, Scandinavia is like an outlier. They're off to one side. A lot of corruption in the US. But corruption's costly. Corruption's another kind of tax and makes it very difficult to do business on a kind of fair and level field if you're concerned about that. One of the big problems in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is why there's a lot of foreign direct investment flowing in now, is because there's such a strong need to improve infrastructure. The roads are not good. Who's going to agree with me? Yeah, the roads are not good. If I want to get on a plane and travel from Tanzania to, which you might not think would be all that hard, if I want to get on a plane in Tanzania and I want to travel to Namibia on the other side of, you know, both in southern Africa, one on the Indian Ocean side, one on the Atlantic Ocean side, I literally might have to fly to Europe to change planes to get from one place to another. So the travel infrastructure, the roads, the electrical infrastructure, all need a lot of work to support the kind of expansive creative destruction that will really help continue propelling Africa forward. And costs of business, they still do need to come down. They're still pretty high. Not as high as, there are some places that depending upon which category of doing business you're looking at, Africa might not be the highest, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit still that can be harvested by making improvements to the regulatory regime in many countries. If you do all those things, the good thing about that is that you'll pull people out of the informal economy. And the informal economies in Africa are, like they are in many developing countries, they're quite extensive. Maybe between 50 and 70% of any African economy is going to take place informally. That means businesses are not registered. That means businesses are not paying taxes. That means that the kinds of services governments usually provide as a result of having tax revenue, they can't provide, at least not with tax revenue anyway. They might try to provide it with official development assistance or with some other source of revenue. But not having a solid tax base means that things like regular road maintenance, upgrades to schools, provision of electrical services if electricity is provided by a government monopoly, those things don't take place the way they would in other countries because you don't have that consistent tax base to draw on. A country that's worked really hard to change that is Rwanda. Rwanda is one of the great reformers in sub-Saharan Africa. The president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, has made it kind of his mission in life to become something like the Lee Kuan Yew of Africa. He's very interested in creating a business-friendly environment. He's very interested in reducing corruption. He doesn't necessarily like political opponents, but he's really not happy about corruption. And he's made it a goal of his to create an efficient tax collecting system in Rwanda. And that in turn is then used to support some of the services that his citizens are demanding. So it's not that everything is perfect, definitely not. I don't want to give you that impression. But overall, for most Americans, if you take a look at what's going on in Africa, you will be surprised to see how much good is going on the ground. And a lot of that good is happening because there's more freedom today for people to go out and break stuff. More opportunity for people to break stuff in a creative way rather than in a destructive way. More opportunity for people to engage in an economy, to not be fearful of engaging in that economy, but to engage in an economy so that they can serve consumers both in their country, in their community, and across the world. So that's my story for you tonight. It's a hopeful story. Things are definitely changing in Africa for the better. And I would say a lot of it has to do with the fact that Africans, like Americans, are really embracing creative destruction. Thank you.
Well, we thank Karol so much for the talk, and we'd love to open it up for questions if anybody has any questions for Karol.
Oh, don't be shy.
I have at least one, if you'll give me that privilege. So your examples of the creative destruction there clearly benefited middle and even lower income folks. But how much, is that true broadly? Like I see here, Teslas are very expensive right now. At one day that'll benefit everybody, but it's not starting that way. So the examples you showed us, is that typical of what's going on there? Are most of the kind of startups aimed at this growing middle class, or?
Yeah, I would say most of the venture capital money that I see anyway in Africa is not aimed at the bottom of the pyramid, if you're familiar with that phrase. So not necessarily trying to sell to the people who are making around $2 a day, but people who are making a little bit more, who have a little bit of disposable income and are willing to spend it on things like education for their kids or new kinds of cell phones. So again, that technology and those changes will end up becoming available to lower income folks. It's not that there's not innovation, I would say, at the bottom of the pyramid, but reaching that bottom of the pyramid market has proved to be pretty challenging, I think, for a lot of, especially consumer companies. So for those of you who don't know the phrase, the bottom of the pyramid, this is an idea that was developed by a Michigan based business, I think he was in the School of Business, C.K. Prahalad, who said that there's a lot of money to be made if you can effectively market to people at the bottom of the economic pyramid. And you can do this if you design products that are going to meet their needs. And so that might be you sell single, it's not a serving, but a single portion of shampoo instead of a whole bottle of shampoo. Because today, I might, if I'm poor, I might be able to afford that one thing of shampoo, the one use of shampoo. I can't afford to buy, a $6 bottle of shampoo, but maybe I can treat myself once every couple of weeks and buy that single serving of shampoo. Or same thing with a lot of other consumer products. But beyond some of those consumer products, I myself haven't seen a large spread of marketing to the bottom of the pyramid that's been successful. Maybe one example, counterexample would be banks are increasingly providing services to low-income folks. So they're trying to innovate around how can I make accounts affordable for the poor. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I have more of a comment than a question, I think. I'm originally from Madagascar, and I would say that for the creative destruction concept itself, at least Madagascar people are very, very comfortable with the status quo, so we like doing what we've been doing, no matter how wrong it is. So for most of the people who are open to new creation, I've had classmates from Madagascar who went to the USA, and it's from seeing what American people do, another mentality, another way of doing things that we actually learn to do something new. So this guy has created a payment for minutes. So he's created that online and all that things. But what I'm trying to say is that the average Madagascar person would not think of these creative destruction ideas, but it has to be taken from another source, another perspective. And for the people who are able to do that already, that's another category of people who either have the money to go or just to be somewhere else.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's an interesting question whether entrepreneurship is sort of a cultural phenomenon. Is the US a more entrepreneurial environment than Madagascar? So I haven't been in Madagascar, but I've been in many places in Africa. And my impression is people are unbelievably entrepreneurial because they kind of have to be. Right? It takes a lot of hard work to figure out how am I going to build a business, feed my family, achieve what I need to achieve in an environment that makes it very, very difficult for me to do that because there are so many political and regulatory restraints. So there's a lot of necessitous entrepreneurship. There's not necessarily the same kind of formal sector entrepreneurship, but I think that as things change a little bit, and I'd be really curious to hear what you think, I think as things change a little bit and there's a little bit more freedom and a little less burdens, the burdens are lifted a little bit for entrepreneurs, that people are gonna pretty quickly start coming up with great ideas. They're gonna think of new ways to do things. They're gonna create interesting value-added businesses, whether it's based on cashews, and now, so maybe Madagascar becomes the cashew butter capital of the world because that's your comparative advantage. So I'm not sure that I think culture, I don't know what I think about the cultural argument. I guess maybe I'll leave it at that.
To go off from what she said, since I'm from Ghana, me and my mom, before we came to this country, we used to sell bread. And the lady across the street got a bread maker. But since we lived in the village, no one knew how she was making the bread so quickly. People were really confused. So no one ever bought from her because they just weren't really sure.
Huh.
And the innovation part is just like people don't know how, I don't know, people aren't really educated on the creative part. They just want to, they're so used to the old-fashioned way of things in the village.
It's very disruptive. Creative disruption is, it's called creative disruption, and there's destruction, and it's disruptive, and a lot of people don't like disruption. even, here, you can think of areas where here in the US, people don't necessarily like things to change. They don't necessarily want things to change. A figure I didn't get to share with you, I was talking with Dr. DeBaker about this before we came over. In 1900, there were approximately 100,000 people in the United States working building carriages. There are no people, maybe there are 10, I don't know, 10 people left making carriages in the United States. So all those carriage makers lost jobs when the auto industry started. But in 1900, there was nobody who was working as a computer programmer. And today, there are over 2.6 million people in the United States doing that job. So it's created, people may not like the process of losing jobs, but jobs get replaced with other jobs. And over time, those other jobs seem to pay better incomes to people and allow people to have a higher standard of living. But that's pretty funny about the bread machine.
The industry I work in is invested in Africa a lot of times, and they usually bring a lot of capital in and then they isolate themselves, and they tend to bring their own workers in for the higher wage jobs. Is that tending to happen now, where they're just more using the labor, and the investment is more isolated to themselves, where they make their own little island for their own plant and everything, and not really investing in any of the rest of the structure or the education to bring people there into the higher paid jobs that they have?
Yeah, that's a pretty typical Chinese model. When the Chinese when they're doing infrastructure development, they will literally bring people from China to do the work and house them in hostels, and they'll be fed they'll bring cooks and feed people. And that creates a lot of dissension. I mean, you can kind of understand why that would be the case. Local people would like to see investment. In my experience is local people want investment in many cases, but they also would like for that investment to create opportunities for them to get jobs. So I think it really depends. A company like Cargill that goes into Nigeria, Cargill's building a big cassava factory right now in Nigeria. Cargill is it's a mechanized cassava production facility. So they're not going to have tons of jobs in the production facility, but they're going to work with outgrowers who are growing cassava on smallholder farms around the nuclear farm that they built. So that's maybe a model that's a little bit more, involves local communities in a more meaningful way. There are lots of different ways companies can be involved. The Chinese have a particularly bad reputation for the way they get involved. But I haven't seen a ton of American investments going into Africa that involve expansive job opportunities. So lots of manufacturing jobs, for example. It's not the kind of outsourcing that might have happened in Asia going on in most of Africa, even though Africa has certain trade benefits under the African Growth Opportunity Act, the AGOA Act, to send textiles, for example, here. Yes.
Yeah, I think you pointed out something that is really, really important in terms of technology. I'm from Nigeria, and another thing I'll add to that is that the demography is actually favoring Africa as well.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of young people who have access to cell phones. So some of the upheaval you see is really connected to that, and I think once it's put to good use, I think there will be a lot more creative destruction. Another thing.
You're responsible.
Okay, I don't know if I'm a youth or if I'm part of that, but another thing I wanted to say was that really the people's fear of failure is a huge thing back home, because I have a lot of people who have businesses in Nigeria, and one of the things you really don't want to do is to fail at what you're doing, because the society, for one, would look at you as though you are someone who doesn't know what he's doing. So there's a lot of stigma attached to that. So unless there's a way people could get bankruptcy and they kind of isolate themselves from having this problem of being a failure, not many people would be willing to do something that is radical to kind of switch things around, because if it fails, believe me, people are just gonna, nobody would want to associate with you because you just have negative energy or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. So this whole Silicon Valley notion that you got to go out and fail fast, fail big, that is not, we haven't been hearing that. That's a fairly new message in some ways. But behind that message, it actually has been pretty easy for Americans to fail. And I think you're right. I don't think there's the same social stigma in the US to trying something and not succeeding. I think, we have a pretty entrepreneurship-friendly environment. We know that some businesses work, other businesses don't work, and we actually want people to get out there after they fail and try again, get back up on the horse. And yes, I do recognize that that's not necessarily the same in other countries. But again, I wonder if the institutions changed and made it, and were friendlier towards both the exiting from a business as well as the entry into a business, would mindsets and norms begin to shift a little bit on that point? And I don't know. I mean, it's not good. It's not just Africa where it's bad to fail. There are lots of other parts of the world where failing is frowned upon. And people are risk averse, right? It's very risky to start your own business. And if you're starting your own business with your family's money, you got to be really careful. And you don't want to fail. So yes, understood. It can be very daunting to undertake those risks. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned that not a lot of manufacturing is currently, like the manufacturing sector in Africa is currently not growing very fast. Are there any particular reasons for that? And do you think with jobs moving out of China and places such as Mongolia and the Philippines, will manufacturing come to Africa in the near future?
So I think one of the reasons why there's not a ton of manufacturing is because in general, the people are not maybe quite as well educated, and productivity levels may not be quite as high as they might be in some other places. But yeah, Africa's going to have this amazing youth bulge coming up soon, and we'll have more young people than any other region of the world. So I think that if education were a little bit better, you had stable environments. So that combination is not a great combination. Not a lot of in uneven education levels. Some countries have great education levels, some countries don't though. Uneven education levels, coupled with political instability, you don't know that your property is going to be secure in some countries. So you might not be willing to build a big expensive plant if you're not sure your property is going to actually be secure. Yes, sir.
Is that the reason why the Chinese are actually bringing in Chinese workers to work in Africa?
I mean, a lot of the Chinese workers are building. They're building roads, and yeah, it's not like it's high-skilled work. A lot of it that folks are doing. I think there's probably a comfort level with working with your countrymen. Maybe there's less comfort working with people whose norms are different from yours. I probably shouldn't speculate on what the Chinese are doing. But they probably have more control over their own laborers than they would have over local laborers.
One of the things about what he's saying is that when a lot of the investment Chinese are making in Africa is from maybe the export agencies. So in importing Chinese labor, what they're actually doing is that they're actually providing jobs for people who would probably not get jobs back home. So in essence, the African country will take a loan from China, okay? And then when you're building that item, you actually build it with Chinese labor. So at the end of the day, you're actually taking out less out of China than you would have if everything was built in-house. I don't know if...
I mean, that's what China is also doing in Afghanistan as well, where they're building a seaport, and they're doing the same thing. They have Chinese laborers working there.
It's a nice employment, like for them. It's a way to employ a lot of people. So, and people they can control. So.
I'm not so sure about the Chinese, but I do know that my government does contract to Chinese companies, and they have Chinese workers to actually build the roads. But another one, a company called Colas, which is a French company, also is contracted by the government to build our other roads too. And most of the higher level positions are owned by foreigners. I'm talking Indians, Europeans, or Americans. And most of the time, it seems to me because the Madagascar folk don't have the skills necessary to perform.
Yeah, so I mean, it's typical for someone, for development, international development types to say about any country, really, in the developing world, there's a lack of capacity. There's a capacity gap. And that may be the case. There may be only so many surveyors. There may be only so many engineers. There may be only so many management experts. It's really hard to be a good manager. You know, maybe in this particular country that's been very closed for a long time, has not had a competitive market, has had a lot of government-led monopolies. Maybe there's not a lot of capacity to produce products that are as high quality as you'd like to produce, and you would produce in a more open market economy. So, you know, the capacity has to be built. Capacity gets built by people having experiences. As economies open up, people are every day building capacity. So the way that capacity looks today is very different from the way it's going to look 5 or 10 years from now, if there's some openness in the economy. People are very resilient. People develop capacity very quickly. It's kind of remarkable. Okay, well, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us this evening, and appreciate your time and attention.